You think a black waitress could ever understand what it means to hold power in her hands? Please, give her a black card and she'll waste it on junk. The words cut through the air like a blade. They weren't whispered. They were spat out, sharp enough for everyone at the long mahogany table in the private dining room of a Manhattan tower to hear. Laughter followed, polite but poisonous. At the head of the table sat Alexander Reed, a billionaire CEO who had built an empire of steel and glass. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Across from him, standing awkwardly in a modest uniform with a tray still balanced in her hand, was Aaliyah Brooks. 23 years old, a waitress in a neighborhood diner in Brooklyn. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not among the polished actresses, sharp-dressed attorneys, and flawless models who usually orbited Alexander's world. She had been invited for one reason only: to test the truth behind what people do when money has no limits. In front of her, resting on the white tablecloth like a loaded weapon, was a black credit card. Unlimited, no ceiling, no rules. Alexander had given 4 women 3 days, and the same offer. What they did with that power would reveal everything. The room brimmed with judgment. Eyes slid over Aaliyah as though she were invisible. Or worse, laughable. A server who smelled like coffee and cheap detergent, standing in the spotlight of a billionaire's twisted experiment. The other women smirked, already imagining their shopping sprees, their yachts, their headlines. But Aaliyah's hand trembled as she picked up the card. Her dark eyes didn't flash with greed. They flickered with something else entirely. And that was the moment Alexander felt the first crack in his certainty. Because this wasn't just another test. This was about to become a black story unlike any he had ever told himself. One that would strip away the lies he had lived in for years. Stay with this story. You'll want to see where that card leads, and why it shocked a man who thought he had already seen it all. Alexander Reed was not the kind of man who stumbled into experiments by accident. He was a strategist, a deal-maker, a billionaire CEO who lived in the glass towers of Manhattan and could see farther than most. But money, as endless as it was, had carved something hollow inside him. And that emptiness had a history. Years earlier, Alexander had fallen in love, not once, but twice. Both times, he believed he had found someone who saw him for who he was, not for the number of zeros in his account. Both times, he was wrong. The first woman left him for a rival executive, walking away the moment his stock dipped during a rough quarter. The second lingered longer, whispering promises of forever while siphoning off his wealth through a web of fake charities. When the truth came out, Alexander lost more than money. He lost trust. Since then, every smile directed at him looked rehearsed. Every compliment sounded like a sales pitch. He had reached a point where he could sit in a crowded room, surrounded by admirers, and still feel utterly unseen. It wasn't loneliness that haunted him. It was suspicion. The belief that no one could ever love him apart from the empire he had built. That was when the idea began to gnaw at him. What if he stripped everything down to one simple choice? What if he handed someone a key to unlimited wealth and simply stepped back to watch? Would greed expose itself immediately, or would something deeper emerge? For Alexander, this was not entertainment. It was confirmation, a test of human nature. He wasn't interested in small gestures. He wanted to see what people did when no boundaries stood in their way. Would they chase vanity, ambition, status, or would they reach for something he had long stopped believing in: compassion, selflessness, maybe even love? He selected 3 women who already moved in his world: a glamorous actress, a powerful attorney, and a model who thrived on the spotlight. Predictable, polished, and hungry. But then, almost without planning, he added a 4th, a waitress, a young black woman from Brooklyn who had served him coffee one evening when he slipped into her diner, alone and restless. She had not recognized him, had not cared who he was. She had only smiled, offbeat and genuine, and told him his tie was crooked. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him that simply. That small moment lingered, and now she was part of his experiment. 4 black cards, 4 women, 3 days, and one truth he could no longer ignore. Before Aaliyah Brooks even stepped into the picture, 3 names were already etched into Alexander Reed's plan. These were not random choices. They were women who embodied the very world he had come to distrust: polished, powerful, and hungry for more. The first was Victoria Hale, an actress whose face had graced movie posters across Times Square. She was the kind of star who floated into a room like she owned the air itself. Draped in couture, diamonds flashing from her wrist, she had spent years perfecting the art of attention. Victoria was beautiful, no doubt, but it was the practiced kind of beauty, sharpened like a weapon and pointed at anyone who dared look away. Her life was one long performance, and Alexander knew that giving her a black card would be like handing a script to her ego. He could already imagine the headlines: Victoria Hale's $1 million shopping spree. The second was Samantha Cruz, a powerhouse attorney known for dismantling opponents in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. She wore ambition the way soldiers wore armor. Samantha's charm was intellectual, laced with calculation. Every move she made was part of a larger strategy, every smile designed to win an advantage. She had told Alexander once, half-jokingly, that if she wasn't billing $500 an hour, she wasn't breathing. He never forgot that line. Giving Samantha unlimited access to wealth would not be about indulgence. It would be about leverage. How would she turn money into influence, and influence into power? The third was Madison Clark, a model whose entire life revolved around the glow of cameras and the whisper of magazine covers. Madison was spectacle in motion. Her Instagram following was larger than the population of small cities, and she thrived on the constant validation of strangers. She knew how to tilt her head just so, how to capture light, how to turn her every breath into content. To Alexander, Madison was the embodiment of surface. He didn't doubt that her black card would vanish into luxury boutiques, champagne towers, and exclusive nightclubs before the first sunset. Together, these three women represented everything Alexander had grown weary of: fame, ambition, vanity. They were predictable in their hunger, and that was exactly why he chose them. They would serve as the control group in his silent experiment. Because if all three reached for greed, and one reached for something else, the truth would be undeniable. The night Aaliyah Brooks stepped into Alexander Reed's world, she didn't come with flashing cameras or an entourage. She came carrying a tray. At 23, Aaliyah worked double shifts at a Brooklyn diner, where the coffee was cheap, the tips unpredictable, and the regulars knew her by name. She wasn't famous, she wasn't powerful. But she had something the others didn't, an authenticity that couldn't be bought. Her smile was quick, her laugh unpolished, and her eyes carried a depth that made people pause, even if they couldn't explain why. When Alexander added her name to the list, it was almost impulsive. But when she walked into that polished dining room in Midtown Manhattan, it was clear she didn't belong, not by society's standards anyway. The chandeliers cast a golden glow across marble floors, and the other women were already perched like royalty, draped in designer gowns. Aaliyah wore a simple black dress she had borrowed from her cousin, hemmed awkwardly at the bottom because it was too long. She clutched her thrift store purse like a lifeline. The moment she entered, silence broke into whispers. Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. Madison leaned close to Samantha, her laugh muffled but sharp enough to cut. Aaliyah felt the sting of their eyes on her skin, a reminder of the invisible line society had drawn long before she arrived. She had lived with that look her entire life, the look that said, "You are less. Less valuable, less important, less deserving." And yet, when Alexander slid the black envelope across the table toward her, Aaliyah didn't hesitate to pick it up. She turned it over in her hands, studying it as though it were a puzzle, not a prize. "You're giving this to me?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. Alexander nodded once. 3 days, no limits. Spend it however you see fit. The room buzzed with amusement. Someone muttered, "She'll probably buy sneakers and fast food." Another added, "Maybe a wig and cheap gold hoops." The laughter stung, but Aaliyah didn't flinch. She slipped the card into her purse, lifted her chin, and simply said, "We'll see." It was a small moment, but it shifted something in the room. The others had accepted their cards with arrogance, already planning their indulgences. Aaliyah accepted hers with quiet defiance. And for the first time that night, Alexander Reed found himself leaning forward, intrigued. It didn't take long for the first transactions to appear. Alexander had instructed his assistant, Daniel, to monitor the accounts in real time. By the end of the first day, The screen lit up with purchases that told him exactly what he expected. Victoria Hale, the actress, wasted no time announcing her spree. She swept into Fifth Avenue with a camera crew in tow, letting the paparazzi document her every move. By sunset, she had draped herself in diamonds, ordered a custom gown from a Paris designer, and put down a deposit on a private yacht moored in Miami. It wasn't about the things themselves. For Victoria, it was about the headlines. She wanted the world to know that her life sparkled brighter than anyone else's. "This," she said to the flashing cameras outside a boutique, "is what freedom looks like." Samantha Cruz, the attorney, approached her card with a colder precision. She didn't buy handbags or champagne. Instead, she called in contractors, consultants, and lobbyists. By the second day, she had secured an entire office floor in a downtown skyscraper. She labeled it the Cruz Power Initiative, a think tank designed to push her influence into politics. To Samantha, money was never for pleasure. It was for leverage. Each transaction was a calculated step toward a bigger throne. Alexander almost admired the discipline, but he also recognized it for what it was: another hunger, another climb, another grasp at control. Madison Clark, the model, treated the card like an extension of her social media account. She booked a penthouse suite in Las Vegas, ordered champagne by the crate, and threw a party that pulsed under neon lights. Every moment was captured on video, every glittering drink poured into a glass held high for her followers to see. "Living limitless," she captioned one post, as if the black card had been created solely to fuel her brand. Thousands of likes poured in, but Alexander saw nothing new. It was spectacle without substance, validation without meaning. Watching the three women spend was like watching a script play out. Fame, ambition, vanity, each predictable, each shallow in its own way. Alexander leaned back in his chair, sipping whiskey as Daniel read off the totals. Tens of thousands gone in less than 48 hours. He felt no surprise, no disappointment. This was exactly what he had expected. And yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, a question stirred. What about the waitress? What would Aaliyah Brooks do with a card that could buy anything? When Daniel refreshed the monitor to check Aaliyah's transactions, he expected the same pattern he had seen with the others. Maybe a shopping spree at a luxury mall, a designer handbag, or a trip booked to some beach resort. Instead, the screen filled with purchases that looked almost absurd compared to the others. "Groceries," Daniel read aloud, his voice uncertain. "A bulk order of rice, canned goods, fresh produce, and paint from a hardware store in Brooklyn." He scrolled further. Children's toys, diapers, second-hand clothes. And he stopped, frowning. 200 hot dogs. Alexander almost laughed, but something in his chest tightened instead. 200 hot dogs. That wasn't vanity. That wasn't greed. That was something else. Meanwhile, the whispers had already started among the elite women. At Madison's Vegas party, someone pulled up the list of Aaliyah's purchases and read them aloud between shots of champagne. Laughter erupted. "She's treating a black card like a food stamp," one man sneered. Victoria smirked and clinked her glass. "You can dress poverty in a black dress, but it's still poverty." The comments spread quickly, like poison in the air. To them, Aaliyah's choices were embarrassing, proof that she didn't belong at the same table. But Alexander didn't hear embarrassment in those receipts. He heard a mystery. 2 days in, he followed the trail himself. He drove away from the towers of Manhattan, away from the polished restaurants and velvet ropes, and into Brooklyn's quieter streets. The buildings here were older, the sidewalks cracked, the storefronts worn. And then he found it the community center, its windows taped with plastic, its bricks chipped from years of neglect. Outside, a rented van sat parked with its doors open. Aaliyah was there, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, carrying boxes inside with a group of neighborhood kids. They swarmed around her, laughing, shouting, grabbing bags of food and toys from her arms. Aaliyah's laughter rang out with theirs, unpolished and real, the kind that spilled into the street like sunlight. Alexander stayed in his car for a long time, just watching. He had expected greed. He had expected ambition. But he hadn't expected this, a young woman using unlimited wealth not to elevate herself, but to feed, to paint, to give. It was the first crack in the wall around his cynicism, and though he didn't want to admit it, he was beginning to care what else she might do. The gala was held in a glass ballroom overlooking the Hudson River, the kind of place where even the chandeliers seemed to whisper about power. Guests arrived in chauffeured cars, cameras flashed at every step, and the air buzzed with champagne and ambition. It was Madison's night, a party thrown with the full force of her black card. The guest list sparkled with actors, bankers, and politicians. Everyone who was anyone was there. And then there was Aaliyah. She didn't glide in draped in couture. She walked quietly through the doors in a navy dress she had borrowed from a neighbor, simple flats on her feet, her hair pulled into a neat bun. She didn't carry herself like a woman on display. She carried herself like a woman trying not to take up too much space, but her presence alone was enough to shift the air. Whispers started before she even reached the table. "Is she staff?" someone asked, eyes narrowing. "No," another answered. "That's the waitress he gave the card to." Laughter rippled across the room, low but unmistakable. Madison, dressed in a sequined gown that shimmered under the lights, leaned toward Samantha and murmured, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You can give a girl from Brooklyn $1 million, but you can't buy her class." When the first toast was raised, Aaliyah's glass wasn't filled with champagne like the others. A waiter set down a cheaper wine at her place. Guests smirked. "Fitting," one man whispered. She wouldn't know the difference anyway. The humiliation deepened when Victoria, ever the performer, took the microphone to make a speech. She smiled sweetly, then let her words cut sharp. "It's inspiring, isn't it? Seeing how generosity works. Some of us build legacies, others." She paused, glancing directly at Aaliyah. "Buy hot dogs." The crowd erupted with laughter, the sound bouncing against the glass walls like cruel applause. Aaliyah sat frozen, the burn of humiliation crawling up her neck. She wanted to leave, to disappear back into the safety of Brooklyn's streets. But when her eyes flicked to Alexander across the room, she found him watching. His expression wasn't mocking, it wasn't amused, it was troubled, as if he, too, realized the cruelty had gone too far. She lifted her chin, refusing to cry, refusing to let them see her break. In that moment, Aaliyah didn't look small at all. She looked defiant. And for Alexander Reed, that quiet defiance spoke louder than the laughter of the entire room. After the gala, Alexander couldn't sleep. The laughter, the sneers, the sound of Victoria mocking hot dogs still echoed in his mind. But what haunted him most was the way Aaliyah had sat there, shoulders straight, chin lifted, refusing to break. Something inside him told him she was hiding more than anyone in that ballroom could imagine. So he asked Daniel to pull every transaction again, this time with full details. What appeared on the screen was not a shopping spree. It was a map of selflessness. The groceries she had bought were not for herself. They had been delivered to a food pantry in Brooklyn that was struggling to keep its shelves stocked. The toys and diapers had gone to a shelter for single mothers. The second-hand clothes were donated to families who had lost everything in a fire. And those 200 hot dogs? They were for a block party she had organized, right outside the crumbling community center she had been quietly restoring. Alexander leaned closer as Daniel scrolled. Paint, lumber, cleaning supplies all purchased for that same center. Aaliyah wasn't building her own empire. She was rebuilding a place that the city had long forgotten, a place where children could feel safe after school, where neighbors could gather, where hope could exist again. But the part that silenced the room came next. A large payment to a local hospital, listed under charity. Daniel looked at Alexander, his voice quieter now. She paid off the medical bills for a woman with breast cancer, someone who couldn't afford treatment. Alexander felt his chest tighten. He remembered Aaliyah telling the waiter at the gala that her mother had passed when she was young. Now he understood. She wasn't just throwing money away. She was fighting battles for others, battles she knew too well. And then came the last transaction. $50,000 wired to establish a scholarship fund specifically for black students in Brooklyn who wanted to study but couldn't afford tuition. Alexander sat back, stunned. The actress had bought diamonds, the lawyer had bought power, the model had bought attention, but the waitress, the one everyone mocked, had bought futures. For the first time in years, Alexander felt shame. Shame that he had doubted her, shame that he had let others laugh at her, shame that it had taken numbers on a screen for him to see what was already in front of him. And with that shame came something else. Admiration. Maybe even something deeper. The truth about Aaliyah's spending should have been the moment everything turned in her favor. But in Alexander Reed's world, nothing stayed pure for long. The more light shone on her actions, the more shadows gathered around her. It started with a headline splashed across a gossip site: "Waitress uses billionaire's card for self-promotion." The article twisted her generosity into ambition, claiming the food donations were staged photo ops, the scholarship fund a publicity stunt. Within hours, other outlets picked up the story. By morning, Aaliyah's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. At the next board meeting, investors whispered among themselves. One slid a newspaper across the polished oak table toward Alexander. The headline screamed in bold letters: "Charity scam, billionaire's black card tied to misused funds." Alexander tried to defend her at first, insisting the transactions were clean, the records clear. But then photos surfaced, grainy shots of Aaliyah standing outside the community center, smiling with children, holding bags of supplies. To the outside world, they looked like staged campaign images. To those who already doubted her, they were proof. Victoria and Samantha fueled the fire. Victoria gave an interview where she smirked at the camera and said, "I admire her hustle. Turning hot dogs into headlines? That's clever." Samantha went further, suggesting that Aaliyah was using charity as a ladder and hinting she had pocketed money for herself. Madison didn't need to say much. Her silence, paired with carefully timed posts of her own glamorous life, was enough to draw the contrast. The pressure mounted until even Alexander began to waver. That night, he confronted Aaliyah in the quiet of his penthouse kitchen. She was scrubbing a pan, humming softly, when he set the newspaper down in front of her. "Tell me this isn't true," he said, his voice lower than usual but heavy. Aaliyah froze. Her eyes moved from the headline to his face, and what she saw there made her chest tighten. Doubt. After everything, he still doubted her. "You think I did this for me?" Her voice cracked, but her gaze stayed steady. "After everything you've seen, you still believe I'd steal from kids, from mothers, from people who need it more than I ever will?" Alexander hesitated. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The silence between them stretched, sharp as glass. Then Aaliyah pulled the black card from her purse and laid it on the counter. "Keep it," she whispered. "I don't need your money, and I don't need your doubt." She turned, grabbed her coat, and walked out. The sound of the door closing echoed through the penthouse like a verdict. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed felt something money could never fix. Regret. For days, Alexander Reed lived with the echo of that door slamming shut. The penthouse that once felt like a fortress now felt like a cage, every corner filled with silence heavier than his billion-dollar empire could bear. But beneath the regret, a spark of doubt still flickered, not about Aaliyah, but about the story being told about her. Something didn't add up. He called Daniel into his office. "Pull everything again," Alexander ordered. "Not just the transactions. I want to know who leaked the story, who fed the press, and who's benefiting from it." Daniel nodded and worked through the night. When he returned the next morning, his face was pale. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were contracts, payments, and emails. All of them pointed to one truth. Victoria and Samantha. Victoria had paid a photographer to trail Aaliyah, snapping shots at just the right angles to make her look staged. Samantha had contacted a journalist she'd once defended in court, feeding him half-truths and insinuations. Together, they had crafted the scandal, turning generosity into deception, kindness into manipulation. Their motive was as old as ambition: eliminate the competition, reclaim Alexander's attention, and destroy the one woman who threatened their power. Alexander gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles whitened. Shame washed over him. He had let their lies blind him, even for a moment. And in that moment, he had pushed away the only person who had shown him something real. That evening, Alexander didn't wait for strategy or subtlety. He stormed into a charity event where both Victoria and Samantha were preening for cameras. With a voice that cut through the music, he laid the evidence bare. "This woman you mocked," he declared, holding up the files, "is the reason children in Brooklyn have food, shelter, and hope tonight. And you, he turned to Victoria, then to Samantha. You are the liars who twisted her name for your own gain. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Victoria's face drained of color. Samantha tried to argue, but the evidence was undeniable. Their reputations unraveled in real time, collapsing under the weight of their own schemes. But Alexander wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about Aaliyah, about her laughter outside the community center, about the way she had lifted her chin in that ballroom when everyone tried to break her. He had doubted her once. He would not make that mistake again. And so, as the crowd erupted around him, Alexander made a decision. He would find her, he would apologize, and he would prove that this time, his belief in her was stronger than the lies of the world. When Alexander finally found Aaliyah, she was not in the places he was used to, no glittering ballrooms, no rooftop lounges. She was in Brooklyn, inside the worn brick walls of the community center she had nearly rebuilt with her own hands. Children ran around her as she bent down to tape paper stars to the wall for a school play. She laughed when one of the kids stuck a star to her forehead instead. It was not the laugh of someone seeking attention. It was the laugh of someone who belonged exactly where she was. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like Alexander Reed, the billionaire. He felt like a man who was about to lose the only person who had shown him the truth. When she finally noticed him, her smile faded. She straightened, dusting glitter from her hands. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice guarded. Alexander stepped closer, his throat dry. "I came to say I was wrong. I doubted you when I should have defended you. I let their lies cloud what I had already seen with my own eyes." Aaliyah crossed her arms, searching his face. "And why should I believe you now?" He pulled out the folder Daniel had given him, the proof of Victoria and Samantha's scheme. "Because this time, I didn't just believe. I made sure. You don't owe me forgiveness, Aaliyah. But I owe you the truth, and I owe you my respect." Number 4. For a long moment, the room was quiet, except for the sound of children laughing down the hall. Then, Aaliyah exhaled, the tension in her shoulders softening. "Respect," she said softly, almost to herself. "That's worth more than any card you could hand me." It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. In the weeks that followed, Alexander didn't return to the penthouse parties or the hollow applause of the elite. Instead, he and Aaliyah worked side by side, expanding the center, creating scholarships, and building a foundation dedicated to lifting up voices that were too often silenced. The tabloids had called it a scandal, but the people of Brooklyn called it something else: justice. And somewhere in the middle of it all, as they painted walls side by side and laughed with children who had never known such joy, Alexander realized the experiment was never about money. It was about finding the one person who could see him without it. And in Aaliyah's eyes, he had finally found that person. Months passed, and the story of Alexander Reed and Aaliyah Brooks spread far beyond the glass towers of Manhattan or the narrow streets of Brooklyn. For some, it was just another headline about a billionaire and a woman who had defied expectations. But for those who looked closer, it became a reminder that wealth means nothing if it is not used to lift others. Alexander often said later that the most expensive lesson of his life cost him nothing at all. It was a lesson taught not by numbers on a balance sheet, but by a young black waitress who refused to bend under ridicule, who showed him that generosity and courage were stronger than any black card ever printed. The truth is, we all face versions of Alexander's experiment in our own lives. We may not be given unlimited credit cards, but we are given choices. Choices about how we spend our time, our words, our resources, and our influence. Some people use those choices to chase attention or power. Others, like Aaliyah, use them to heal, to feed, to create opportunities for people who have been overlooked. And perhaps the greatest challenge is this: when the world mocks kindness, when generosity is mistaken for weakness, do we still stand tall? Aaliyah did. She faced humiliation in a room full of people who doubted her worth, and she answered not with anger, but with action. That is the kind of quiet strength that changes more than headlines. It changes lives. So here is the question for you. If someone handed you unlimited resources, what would you do with them? Would you chase status, or would you build something that outlasts you? That choice, more than money or fame, is what defines who we are. If this black story moved you, if it made you stop and think about what really matters, let it be more than just another video you watch and forget. Leave a comment, even a single word, to remind yourself of the lesson. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that kindness is not weakness, it is power. Because in the end, Alexander's wealth did not make him rich. Aaliyah's courage did. And that is a truth we can all carry, no matter what is in our wallets.